in both of your opinions, what are the most difficult topics for students to grasp on Series 7 that you see in your tutoring? Well, I would put options in that mix, certainly. I passed the SIE last week, so kudos. Let's give you the bell for that. So would you say options, Brian?
Uh, Initially, options is usually the hardest thing for people starting. Eventually, however, most do really proficient on them. For test taking purposes, I think the most difficult, because no one really duplicates them well, are those suitability questions on the test. And there's so many of them.
Okay, well let's back up, okay, because I would not call that a topic. Harold, there are three styles of questions you get on your Series 7. You get recognition, you get practical application, and you get judgment. So those are the three styles of questions you're going to receive on the test. Now, from your SIE testing victory, you know that it's mostly recognition and maybe a couple practical application, like what's the current yield, what's in the money on an option, maybe a couple, 2, 3, 4 practical application. On Series 7, what's being added to the mix are judgment questions. Those are where you go, oh man, I don't know. And Brian just brought up suitability, and that runs across all of the investment vehicles you get tested on. Mutual funds, options, muni bonds, all of those. And they're judgment questions, which makes them challenging, which means you can get to a 50-50. About 10% is judgment questions. Now, I think both Brian and I think the best way to attack those suitability questions, I will link, Harold, to a suitability playlist. I have 4 or 5 videos on suitability. I have a 2 practice tests, I think an STC or Notman, a Kaplan, one I wrote myself. There's an exercise there, so you might want to check that out. But I think it's the horse before the cart thing. I think too many people, Brian, try and jump into suitability before they intellectually own the product or the investment vehicle. In other words, like we just talked about options. They don't know that naked calls are not smart because of unlimited loss. They don't know that a protective put is a hedge, or we'd write calls to generate additional income. So I would apply that as we're talking about options, I think. But Brian's absolutely right about it. Good news. If you get good at contract specifications, you're not struggling that a short put is an obligation to buy the stock, for example. And you can track money. And then at that point, you say, give me 125 option questions. That proficiency comes with work, sometimes tutoring, but we have lots of that on the test. So good point, Brian. Suitability people struggle with. I do think that's one of the biggest step ups from the SIE to the 7.
Yeah.
This idea of recognition on those products versus now how do we use those arrows in our quiver to help people accomplish their financial goals? And even, Harold, I'd add to this, making sure we're not making unsuitable recommendations, right? Which we know partnerships are not liquid, for example. So good point, Brian. What do you think on suitability? Do you think people struggle because of the judgment nature of it?
That and the product knowledge. You got to have good product knowledge on all products, corporate bonds, government bonds, options, mutual funds. That's where all of those suitability questions come from, is based upon your knowledge of those products. You and I both agree. It's got to be product knowledge. And you got
I call that, Harold, lay on the base. You got to lay the base. You can't jump into suitability till the base is laid. Right. And I think some people jump in way too quick to suitability before they actually own those products.